Hello, psychology folks. Welcome to a new week. Actually, the last week of October. Halloween is coming, which is always an interesting psychological holiday. I saw at one point a couple of weeks ago that one of the more popular Halloween costumes was going to be an Ebola hazmat suit. Some of the distributors were selling out online. I'm not sure if that was actually true or hype, but then, as you might expect, there was the backlash of people saying it probably wasn't a good idea and probably insensitive to go trick or treating in an Ebola hazmat suit. And, this kind of gets to the whole concept of social psychology that we've been talking about. What happens to our group psychology when initially when Ebola becomes news. Suddenly people think wearing the hazmat suit is cool, and then maybe when the full sort of horror of the outbreak and the toll that it takes and the human toll on people becomes apparent, then society goes the other direction and decides maybe it's not a good idea. It's an interesting look at the interplay of social psychology and something like what is an appropriate Halloween costume and what is inappropriate. I remember several years ago there was this was when I worked in North Carolina. There was I think it was a Kiwanis club or a Rotary club or something, and they had an annual haunted house, and they really pushed the haunted house to the limit. Had a lot of pretty realistic looking blood and gore. One of the things that they did, they set up a section of the haunted house called Jeffrey Dahmer's Kitchen. And of course, if you're not familiar with Jeffrey Dahmer, he was, I think, clearly mentally ill, serial killer, cannibal, did some really, really horrible things. And so, thinking it was all in good fun, they set up using some pretty nasty material from a local butcher shop, the Jeffrey Dahmer's Kitchen exhibit. You know, not thinking about anything but scaring people and raising money. A local reporter contacted the family of one of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims, told the family about what the haunted house was doing. Family became very upset. It ended up on the news, and then the group apologized and took down that part of the attraction. But again, you sort of see the social psychology significance of that. Initially it was all in good fun. We talked about attribution. They're thinking about things from their own personal perspective. They weren't victims of Jeffrey Dahmer, didn't know his victims. He was just sort of a scary figure from the news to them, and so they were going to use that to raise money and have fun. Suddenly, when they're confronted with the family members of someone who actually died in the horrible way that they're depicting in their haunted house, it takes on a completely different perspective. And suddenly it doesn't seem like fun anymore, doesn't seem like a good idea, and they did the right thing and they canceled it. But again, a really interesting perspective on how, based on our perspective of things, whether we're looking at things from our perspective or the perspective of others, what becomes socially acceptable and what doesn't. All right, I want to jump back into our discussion of aggression. I know we talked about this a little bit last time, but it was kind of rushed and some folks missed it. Aggressive behavior. Aggressive behavior, the definition, social behavior with the objective of harming someone. Now, does that necessarily need to be physical harm? I think clearly it doesn't. You look at what happens, particularly now, a lot of attention on cyberbullying, and that would be aggressive social behavior occurring online where you may not be causing direct physical harm. Certainly emotional harm is being caused, and there are cases, sad cases of people who have committed suicide as a result of the bullying that they receive online. So aggressive behavior, social behavior occurring in that social situation with the objective of harming someone. If you remember back to our discussion about the different approaches to psychology, biological, evolutionary, cognitive, etc., there are also those similar perspectives in psychology regarding aggression. So some of the biological factors involved in aggression, and we're taking some time to talk about aggression because really it's a significant player in the fabric of social psychology. We talk a lot about road rage when we talk about social psychology. So aggression seems to come up as a popular topic because it affects so many of us, and it can affect us in really terrible ways. I mean, if you think about the aggression as the starting point for what could end up being a war, think about aggression and perceptions of aggression and how that may have contributed to the Arab conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So the idea of aggression is something that's it's important to talk about. So there are evolutionary factors that appear to be involved in aggression. One is the innate response, innate meaning it's automatic response to be aggressive to protect, whether it is to protect yourself or to protect child, loved one, friend. In animals, it is possible to breed aggression, which is exactly what you do when some of these terrible stories about pit bull fighting, where they'll breed pit bulls to have an aggressive response. I remember years ago when the attack dog of choice was the Doberman Pinscher. You would breed the dogs to be as aggressive as possible. It is questionable whether or not you could do the same thing with humans. If you could actually have a genetic predisposition to be aggressive in a human being, the same as animals. What's interesting about aggression, when it comes to genetic aggression, looking at animals, proactive aggression is genetic. The aggression where you go out and are aggressive to protect or prevent harm. That appears to be something that's passed on in the genes. Reactive aggression and social aggression, in other words, the way that you react to the behavior of others in social situations, that appears to be more environmental. It's based on how you grow up. One of the ways they've determined this is through twin studies, where they'll take twins who are genetically identical, so anything that's caused by their genes should be the same in both of them because they have the exact same gene structure, gene makeup. And when they look at the reactive aggression of twins, how twins who have been raised in different environments react to aggression, they find that they're not the same. And so from that they conclude that reactive aggression and social aggression is caused by the environment that we grow up in. Biological factors in aggression, neurobiological, involving the frontal lobes of the brain, the frontal lobes being this part right here, the part that Phineas Gage had damaged. And as you remember, after Phineas Gage had the iron rod that went through and damaged part of the frontal lobe of his brain, I believe he was more aggressive and an unpleasant person. So the frontal lobes, particularly the limbic system in the frontal lobes, stimulation or damage can cause aggression. Also, as we mentioned in class, neurotransmitters, if you happen to have, for example, a low level of serotonin, that can cause you to be more aggressive. And hormones can cause aggression. Testosterone, you've heard roid rage. People who are abusing steroids in bodybuilding are more prone to have aggressive behavior, and that's caused by the hormones. Interesting that aggression often can be caused by situations that we don't have a lot of control over. Now, you do have control over whether or not you inject hormones, but once the chemical change takes place in your body, it's like you're not sitting there saying, I'm going to choose to be aggressive. It seems to be something that just happens. Also, there are psychological factors that cause aggression, frustrating circumstances, cognitive determinants, meaning you think about your situation and perceive a threat, for example, the presence of a weapon. And then there is observational learning, which we talked about in class. We're going to go ahead and play the Bandura Bobo doll video again. So here we go, for those who might have missed it.
My initial research in observational learning centered on the social modeling of aggression. In our experiment, preschool children observed an adult model beat up an inflated Bobo doll in novel ways. She pummeled it with a mallet, flung it in the air, kicked it repeatedly, and threw it down and beat it. And these novel acts were embellished with hostile remarks. The children were then left in the playroom that had a variety of toys. Now, the children who had observed the aggressive modeling adopted much of it. They even invented new ways for attacking the doll. Children who had not observed the adult model were less aggressive and never hit the Bobo doll in the novel ways that were modeled. The children who had been exposed to the aggressive modeling showed an increased attraction to guns, even though the adult model never used them. At the time we did this research, it was widely believed that seeing others venting aggression would drain away the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to modeled aggression is hardly cathartic. Televised violence has four major effects. It teaches aggressive styles of behavior, weakens restraints over aggression, desensitizes and habituates viewers to human cruelty, and shapes viewers' images of reality. With the enormous advances in the technology of communication, observational learning from the symbolic environment is placing an increasingly powerful role in people's everyday lives. Human attitudes, values, styles of behavior are now being modeled worldwide. As a result, televised modeling is becoming an influential vehicle for political and social change. We now have global broadcasts of societal conflicts as they are happening.
So the Bobo doll experiment, and I think I mentioned in class, there are some things about this experiment that bother me, and I wanted you to think about that, which is one of the reasons why we watched the video again. When we think about experiments, what is the external validity of that experiment? Because think about what Bandura is trying to show. He's trying to show aggressive behavior and how observational learning causes aggression. But what's his ultimate purpose? I mean, what's the point of determining the cause of aggressive behavior? Is it because we want to prevent Bobo dolls from being abused out in the world, because there's the danger of terrible Bobo doll abuse? No, the reason that he's conducting this experiment is he wants to determine the cause of violence and aggression against people. And so clearly you can't conduct an experiment where where kids are watching somebody beat up another person with a hammer in the room. So they use the Bobo doll. So the assumption is that aggression toward a Bobo doll will also indicate aggression toward a human. Well, that doesn't seem to make sense to me. Because one, a child is smart enough to know the difference between a Bobo doll and a person. And so the fact that a child's willing to go into that room and smack a Bobo doll with a hammer, does that mean that then the child is just as likely to go to school and smack their classmate with the hammer? Or is a child smart enough to know that a Bobo doll is a piece of inflated plastic. It doesn't have feelings, it doesn't feel pain, and smacking it is different than smacking a person. It's kind of like going back to my my favorite road rage analogies. I wonder why I seem to be obsessed with road rage. But how often has this happened to you where you'll be driving along and somebody in another car will do something that you consider to be very stupid, and you'll maybe wait for them to catch up, and you'll turn because you're going to say some really nasty things to the person in the car, and when they get up even with you, it's somebody you know, maybe somebody you work with, maybe your boss, and suddenly you don't say anything, or if you were, you had that, you're getting ready to yell, and you're just like, oh, hey, how you doing? Because we tend to, particularly in cars, say things to people in their cars, where they can't hear or see us typically, that we wouldn't necessarily say face to face. There's a difference in how we yell at a car and how we might yell face to face at a human being. Now, sometimes people will yell face to face, but typically we don't. And so I wonder about media violence and video game violence. Are people smart enough to differentiate between the violence that they see on television that is not real and the violence where they're playing in video games and shooting video game characters or whatever, knowing that that's not real? Does that really make them more likely to then commit violence on a human, an actual person, or are they able to differentiate between the two? The other issue that I think really has to be explained, if you take the position that the media, violent movies, violent video games, causes people to be violent through observational learning, you have to look at the statistics. Because when you think about it, let's go back to, say, 1995, how has the number of violent video games, violent movies, violent image throughout the media, how has that changed from 1995 to today? Well, I think you don't even need to do a whole lot of detailed research to know that the amount of media violence that young people are exposed to has gone way, way up. I mean, if you were to make a graph, the curve would shoot way up. Well, look at this. This is a chart from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention of violence, violent acts among, in this chart, young people ages 10 to 24. And this is all ages. And while you can see that violence, the rate per 100,000, is more prevalent in that 10 to 24 year age, when you compare it to all ages, look what's happened from 1994 to looks like about 2011. The amount of violence shot way down. And when you think about it, what was happening to video games and movies from 94 to 2000 as far as the introduction of violence? And now here we see it's leveled off a little bit down, spikes up a bit, and then probably fair to say that some of the most violent video games have been out in the past few years, and here we see violence still ticking down. So if exposure to violent video games is supposed to be correlated with more violence, more comfort with violence, then you would think that you would see this number going up in correlation with the exposure to violent video games and movies. But it doesn't. What's interesting, what's happening, and maybe this goes back to that false consensus effect and some aspects of social psychology. Clearly, when violent incidents occur and they involve young people, we are more likely to be exposed to them because of the media coverage of that violent event. Now you've got live helicopters circling the school, whereas back in 1995 you may have a story in the paper and something that happened in California. Unless you're watching the 6 o'clock news, you might not be exposed to that. Now with the 24-hour, 24/7 news channels, you get it, all news all the time. So it may be that our perception of violence, because we see it reported in the media much more frequently, our perception of violence is going up, and maybe we're assuming that that is connected to people, being exposed to more violent video games and movies, but the actual statistics show that violence is going down. So, while I understand the concept that Bandura is trying to get across of observational learning causing violence, we think about it, we're observational learning, we're sort of back to that behaviorism, the fact that it's something that you do, it's something that you learn based on what you see and observe versus what you think. And I think there's a cognitive aspect to people viewing violent images where you can differentiate between what's on-screen violence and what's real. And now, is there a difference? How are people affected by watching real violence on television? I think that's maybe another interesting point. We've had situations here just very recently where there have been actual videos of very violent acts, beheadings and so forth. And people don't appear to be rushing to put that on the news or to watch that. And in fact, there seems to actually be a backlash where people are saying, don't watch that, I don't want to see that. They tend to understand the difference, and they're horrified by the actual violent act, whereas they may not think twice about movie violence. Anyway, something interesting to consider. All right, for this next section, I want you all to think for a moment. Just put all of the distractions and everything else out of your mind. I want all of you to think for a moment about conformity and obedience. Okay, are you all thinking about conformity and obedience? Everyone? Okay, there you go, end of lesson. Conformity, why do we do what other people want us to do? Why are we obedient when people tell us, when people in authority tell us what they want us to do? Why is it that when if I go outside and stand in the middle of the sidewalk in front of the classroom building and stare up at the sky, eventually people will come over and they'll look up too, because they'll want to know what I'm looking at, and then the more people that look up, the more people that would come over and continue. Why does that happen? And by way of illustrating, have you ever walked past somebody on the street that maybe was asking for help? Did you stop or not? And do the circumstances in which this happens determine whether you stop or not? Do other people around you determine whether you stop and help or not? The idea of helping somebody in need and the way that it is affected by the people around you or no people around you is an interesting experiment and discussion about social psychology. So let's take a look at another video that illustrates this principle.
Place like this street in New York City, if you were unfortunate enough to be the victim of a crime or taken ill unexpectedly, you might think that surrounded by all these people, someone would intervene. After all, isn't there safety in numbers? Psychologists say no. Research suggests that often a victim is less likely to receive assistance when surrounded by a group rather than a single bystander. When people are in a crowd, it's easier to pass the buck. It's what psychologists call the diffusion of responsibility. Liverpool Street Station in London, a busy thoroughfare for commuters. Unknown to these passers-by, Peter is an actor. As part of an experiment on bystander apathy, he's pretending to be ill.
Help. Help.
How long before he gets help?
Please. Help. Help me, sir. Please help me.
Helping would be inconvenient or even risky. He lies there for more than 20 minutes and no one raises an eyebrow.
Please, somebody help me.
It's always very distressing to watch situations like this where people are obviously suffering and no one's actually helping them. But what we have here is two conflicting rules. One is the rule that we ought to help, and the other is the rule that we ought to do what everybody else is doing. And here you have effectively a group of strangers who are exerting the pressure not to intervene, not to help, and it's very difficult to rebel.
Ruth, another actor, takes Peter's place. How long before she receives help? Minutes later, and 34 people have passed without stopping.
Well, people don't really want to know. They just haven't got the time. Well, they have got the time, they just don't want to get involved.
Unwittingly, these strangers have silently formed a temporary group with a rule: don't get involved. They're afraid to stand out from the crowd and won't take action if no one else does. This woman has clearly spotted Ruth, but she conforms to the rule and does nothing. Watch what happens, though, when someone else helps.
You alright? You alright?
Yes, thank you.
Sure, you look a bit clicky, you know what I mean?
She suddenly finds herself in a different group with a new rule: to help.
You want to sit up? You alright, yeah? Sure.
First I thought she was dead. Then I sort of checked to see if she was breathing or not. And I looked around and I couldn't believe that no one had noticed her, because there was a bloke sat there just absorbed in reading a newspaper.
This time, Peter's dressed as a respectable gentleman. Now that his dress is in keeping with those around him, how long before he's rescued?
Hello, sir. How are you today?
I'm alright.
6 seconds. She even calls him sir, and suddenly everyone's a good Samaritan.
Do you suffer from epilepsy?
No.
Why you're lying on the floor in the rain?
Because he's part of the right group. Everyone wants to help.
I would just hate to be in his position of feeling ill and nobody helping him walking past, so I'd just like to check that he was okay.
And I thought, well, it's wet, so he must really be ill because he's going to ruin the suit anyway.
So, did that bother you at all to see that? It kind of bothered me, particularly when you see how quickly the guy in the suit is helped by the compared to the individual who's just laying face down. But could there be other reasons why people might have helped one and not the other? I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, well, the woman looks like maybe she's asleep, and so maybe people might assume that she's sleeping. I don't know. The guy in the suit's laying on his back, where the guy in the first guy in the blue jeans is laying forward, and I kind of wonder, do people maybe perceive that, if you're face down, maybe it's more likely and maybe he's drunk and passed out. But again, you go back to the fact that the way he's dressed perhaps has something to. It bugged me to see the guy sitting on the wall, maybe 5 feet away or 6 feet away from the woman who's laying there, possibly passed out, and just doing absolutely nothing. But it goes back to this idea of this idea of conformity, which is a change in a person's behavior to coincide more closely with a group standard. So when people are walking and they see somebody lying on the floor or on the ground, they're looking around to see what everybody else is doing. And if nobody else is helping, they're making this assumption that, well, they must know something. The group is smarter than me. These other people around me aren't helping, so there must be a reason. They must know that this isn't a situation that you step in and help. Maybe they've seen this individual before. Maybe they know that this person is just intoxicated, which doesn't necessarily mean you still shouldn't help them if they're laying there asking for help. But there's a sense that everybody around me must know better, so I'm going to do what they're doing. Just like me staring up at the sky, and people think, well, there must be something up there, and then 5 or 6 people stare, and everybody thinks, well, they're looking at something, so let me look at it too. But then you see, as soon as somebody sort of breaks that spell and goes and helps, then everybody wants to help. And now it's just the opposite. Everybody changes their behavior to go in and try to be helpful. But it is disturbing to see how the group particularly in that setting where everybody walking around is in suits, and when the person laying down is in a suit, then they'll come to help almost immediately. I thought it was interesting too that the woman who was passed out on the sidewalk, it wasn't one of the suit-wearing executives that stopped to help. It was one of the workers, a guy in jeans and boots that walked over and said, "Hey, are you okay?" And sometimes maybe there are a handful of people that don't conform, and when one of those people walks by, that's when you have change. But interesting thing to think about when it comes to conformity and how we change our behavior based on what others around us do. Then there is the idea of obedience. No, actually, this is conformity. Hold on. Let me find myself here. This is another example of conformity. We've talked about this example in the past, and it's fun to watch. This is Ash's experiment, where people are brought in and they are looking at objects and answering questions, but everybody else in the room is sort of in on the joke. And the idea is to see how far people will go to deny what their own eyes tell them is correct in order to be just like everybody else around them.
But an experiment is not a public opinion poll. It examines behavior under the pressure of social forces, as the experiment of Solomon Asch reveals.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the fifth person with the white t-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3.
But on the third trial, something happens.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
1.
Asch found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1. 1. They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me. 1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1. 1. 1. 2. 1. 2. 2. 2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2. 2. 2. 2.
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group. In this variation, Asch gave the naive subject a partner, here seated in the third position, who also gives the correct response.
1. 1. 2. 1. 2.
With a partner, yielding drops to only 5% of the critical trials compared to 37% without a partner. Although subjects report warmth and good feeling toward the partner, they typically deny that he played a role in their own independence. The partnership variation shows that much of the power of the group came not merely from its numbers, but from the unanimity of its opposition. When that unanimity is punctured, the group's power is greatly reduced. Sometimes we go along with a group because what they say convinces us they are right. This is called informational conformity. But sometimes we conform because we are apprehensive that the group will disapprove if we are deviant. This is called normative conformity. The strength of the normative factor is shown in another variation carried out by Ash. In this variation, the subject is told that because he had arrived late, you would have to write his answers. Subjects in this private response experiment are exposed to the same amount of misleading information as other subjects, but they are immune from any possible criticism by the group.
One.
And this enormously reduces the pressure to conform. Conformity drops by 2/3. Ash's experiment is a classic. It reveals how people will deny what they see and submit to group pressure. It allows us not only to observe conformity, but to study the conditions that increase or reduce its occurrence.
So looking at that experiment, and that was interesting, wasn't it? Can you think of a situation where maybe you or somebody you knew didn't answer a question correctly in order to conform to the group? And I mean, I can think of situations, let's say you've got somebody in a class, it could be middle school, and the teacher is asking the students to answer the question out loud, and everybody's getting it wrong, and maybe this one student's smarter than everybody else, but this student answers the question wrong too, intentionally. Not wanting to stand out from the crowd, not wanting to be different, maybe not wanting to be labeled the brainy kid. And so I think there's an interesting research in looking at meetings and in how people behave in meetings and how they answer questions, more wanting to go along with the group versus stepping out of the box and coming up with a new idea. The other thing that was really interesting, I thought, well, two things. One, the idea that if everybody else is giving the wrong answer and one other person beside you is willing to step up and give the right answer, it sort of supercharges that other person to give the right answer as well, empowers them. That's what I'm looking for. So, if you're sitting in a group and you're afraid to sort of speak up and be different, if you speak up and be different, and there's one other person in that group who's considering speaking up and being different as well, by speaking up, you can actually make that idea stronger. The other thing that I thought was interesting was the written portion, where when all of the others are publicly giving their answer, the person who writes his answer down on paper is more likely to write what he believes to be true, even when it contradicts. And what that made me think of immediately is our policy of having a secret ballot in a democracy. And it sort of reinforces to you why that's important. Because if when we went to the polling place, we had to maybe walk up and publicly make a check on a board, or if they would ask you verbally who you vote for, and they're going down the line of people lined up at the polling center, and they're verbally saying who they're going to vote for, you would be, I would think, influenced to maybe vote for the people who everybody else is voting for. At least according to this research, you would be. You're much more likely to vote what you believe if you vote in secret, because there's that fear of conformity or being nonconformist isn't there in that situation. So, interesting discussion about conformity. Informational social influence, that is influence other people have on us because we want to be right. In other words, we want to be correct, right, don't want to give the wrong answer, and so we look to other people to inform our answers because we want to be right. Normative social influence is the influence others have on us because we want them to like us. So, for example, informational social influence, if everybody else in the room is saying that line B is shorter than line C, we are going to change our answer because we want to be right with the group, and so the group's answer informs our answer. The example I gave of giving the wrong answer in a classroom because we don't want to be the smart kid or the odd kid or the weird kid, we want to be like everybody else and be liked, that would be normative social influence. We're influenced by others because we want them to like us. Group influence. De-individuation means being part of a group reduces personal identity and erodes the sense of personal responsibility. That's what was happening in the video when these groups of people are walking by the person laying on the steps and nobody's doing anything. If everybody else around me is not doing anything, well, then it must be okay to not do anything, and I don't feel that sense, as great a sense of personal responsibility for that person passed out on the steps. If it was just me and them, I'd feel more responsibility to go do something. Social contagion, imitative behavior involving the spread of behaviors, emotions, ideals. You get that, laughing in a group, crying. At a comedy club, you're more likely to have people laughing. If other people are laughing, laughing is contagious. That's why on the old sitcoms they would put a laugh track in there, because if you heard a recording of people laughing, you're more likely to laugh. So social contagion. There can be other things that involve social contagion. The imagination of illnesses. You could have a situation where if there's a particular illness that's prevalent and there are certain symptoms, people might start believing that they have the symptoms, and then others might believe they have the symptoms. It's just the idea that the way people behave around us, we are likely to imitate that in our own behavior. All right, group performance. Social facilitation. An individual's performance improves because of the presence of others. In other words, being part of a group makes you better. Social loafing is kind of the opposite. That's each person's tendency to exert less effort in a group because of reduced accountability for individual effort. If we split the class up into two groups and had a tug of war, chances are the group would be pulling less than if we had individuals one-on-one, because if you're having a one-on-one tug of war, it's your responsibility to either win or lose, and it's you're the winner or the loser. If it's a group, it's less on you and more on the group, and so you're going to exert yourself less. Risky shift. That is an interesting aspect of group behavior, where a group has a tendency, if they're making a joint decision, to make a riskier decision than the average individual might make. So on our own, we're likely to be more conservative. If we're in a group, we're likely as a group, let's say we're taking a vote or a poll, to choose something that might be a little riskier. Because again, it's this idea that we're part of a group and it's not so much our responsibility. Group polarization effect. That is the strengthening of an individual's position because of a group discussion or interaction. In other words, the group reinforces what I already thought. That I think also happens when we surround ourselves on social media with people who agree with us. Our own views are strengthened by virtue of this supporting discussion that we have in this group that also believes the same thing. And then there's groupthink. Groupthink is the impaired group decision-making that occurs when making the right decision is less important than group harmony. You would rather have everybody get along than making the right decision. Now, how often does that happen in government? I can think of some examples in our own region where you have perhaps a city council, and the majority of city council wants to go one way, but you got one or two people that are just making a big stink and are going to make a big fight. And let's say the just pulling an idea out of the air. Let's say the issue is hiring a new city manager, and the majority of the group wants to pick Bob because Bob's been here for 20 years. We think he's great, and we think Bob will be a great city manager. And one person says, "No, we need to pay this search firm $20,000 to conduct a national search for a new city manager. And if we don't do it, I'm going to call a press conference and send out a press release, and I'm going to throw a fit." And so the group decides, okay, well, let's all get along. So we'll go ahead and hire the search firm and have a national search, and we think it'll still be Bob. But to make this one guy happy and to keep there from being this big blow up and problem, we'll go along with that idea, even though maybe it's not what we think is the best idea. That's the idea of groupthink. It can happen in juries, where in a jury, you might have a situation where people would prefer to just have everybody happy and harmonious versus stepping up and standing up for what you think might be the right decision. Influence and persuasion. Let's look at the communication model. Now, this is the old school communication model where you have your sender, your channel, and your receiver. It's sort of modeled after ham radio, I think. And that's the way we used to teach communication. I'm the sender, this video lecture is the channel, and you are the receiver. Straightforward, that's how I communicate information to you. So you have the communicator, me, the medium, this video lecture, the message, what I'm telling you, and the target, which is you. In reality, this is more like the true communication model, where you've got me, the message, the channel, you've got feedback. In this case, it's delayed feedback coming from your emails, and there's a lot of noise, which is what's going on here in the room with me, what's going on in the room with you, your smartphone, your kids, your roommates, your brothers, your parents, and everything else that tends to get in the way of that communication. That's really the communication model that we have today. So influence and persuasion can be difficult. This is not a big part of this chapter, so we're going to hit this really quick. The central route of influence and persuasion, when we're talking about social situations, is engaging with a sound, logical argument. Direct communication. I am going to argue and explain to you through logic why I am correct and you are wrong, or why this is the best candidate and this is not. The peripheral route is what we call non-message factors. A person's credibility, attractiveness. Remember our discussion about how attractiveness makes you trust a person more? Emotional appeal. And that actually is best when the target's not paying attention. You see both of these taking place in the political ads that you're starting to see, and I'm sure you'll be seeing more in the next couple of weeks. You will see ads where the guy's looking at the camera, or the woman is looking at the camera and giving you a sound argument, this is why you should vote for me. And then you have those non-message factors, typically the ones where the outside groups are coming in and maybe trying to scare you, or maybe bringing in some very attractive, personable politician like Bill Clinton or somebody else to try to convince you that their candidate is the best. And interesting, this is best when the target's not paying attention, which probably in television political ads is most of the time. That's more than likely why the majority of the political ads that you see are probably going to have these non-message factors, this peripheral route to persuasion. Successful persuasion, a couple of techniques. There's the foot in the door technique of successful persuasion, and these make use of social psychology. That's when I'm going to ask you for a really for a small request, just a little thing, and hopefully create a relationship so that down the road I can get you to do something much bigger. Sales calls, that can be a situation where you're showing up on the door and saying, hey, would you like to see a demonstration and get a free sample of this great kitchen knife? No obligation. If I can just come in and show you how great this kitchen knife works, and I'll give you this free paring knife just for watching my demonstration. That's not a big ask. I'm not asking you to do a lot, and you get something. And what that's doing is that's getting the foot in the door. That's creating that relationship, because he's not just going to be satisfied with showing me his great knife and giving me a free sample. He wants me to buy the whole $150 set of knives. That's where he's headed. But if he hits me up and says, hey, I want you to buy this set of knives for $150, I'm going to say, oh, no way. But if he asks for a little thing and lets me in the door, then in that situation, he may eventually get me to the big set of knives. The door in the face technique is you make the big pitch first, which you know they're going to say no to, in order to make that smaller pitch more reasonable. And if you use the knife example, and I bring this up because this worked on me several years ago. The guy comes in, he goes, look, I've got these really awesome, amazing knives, kitchen knives. They will change your life. It's only, $250 for this great set. And of course, I'm not going to pay that. He says, well, get that. The economy's tough, but I'll tell you what, it's a special deal just for you. I can sell you this smaller set of 5 for $50. And you get most of the benefits for a whole lot less money. Well, in that situation, the 50 sounds a whole lot more reasonable than the 250. So again, you can see you're using psychological principles to persuade. Resisting persuasion involves a technique called inoculation. And interestingly enough, this is just like getting a flu vaccine, because when you inoculate somebody against the flu, what you actually do is you give them a weakened virus, or in some cases a dead virus, that will get their resistance up, so that when the real flu hits them, their immune system will already be ready to fight it. In persuasive inoculation, that involves introducing a weak version of a persuasive argument and giving someone time to argue against it. And so if you were trying to protect somebody from, let's say, getting nailed by a scam, you might introduce a weak version of the scam argument, let the individual consider that they can easily defend, and then they'll be prepared when the stronger argument comes. All right, enough of that. That is the end. So your assignment for this video lecture is to click reply and comment. What do you think is the most effective method of persuasion? What do you use when you are persuading people, or what method of persuasion works on you? And then also, let's read about memory, pages 202 to 240, I believe, because we'll pick up on memory in our next lecture, which will be this coming Friday. And a reminder, and I'll send an email about this too, will not be in class on Friday. On Friday there will be another video lecture because I will be out that day. Anyway, thank you, and have a great week.